At 1400 hours on May 10, 1943, near Medellin, Tunisia, Oberleutnant Klaus Schmidt stood beside a captured American Jeep, holding a measuring tape against the front suspension while his commanding officer dictated notes. The vehicle had been taken intact 2 days earlier, when American forces abandoned a forward position during the final collapse of Axis resistance in North Africa. Schmidt's unit, part of the Afrika Korps 5th Panzer Army, had been ordered to conduct a full technical evaluation before the inevitable surrender. The Jeep sat there in the Vater, desert sun, dust-covered but mechanically sound. Schmidt measured the ground clearance. 9 inches. The Kübelwagen, Germany's equivalent light vehicle, had 7. He measured the wheelbase. 80 inches. He examined the 4-wheel drive transfer case, the Spicer differential, the 3-speed, manual transmission. Every component was overbuilt, designed to survive punishment that would destroy a German vehicle. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Schmidt had driven Kübelwagens across North Africa for 2 years. He knew their capabilities intimately. The Kübelwagen was lighter at 725 kilograms empty compared to the Jeep's 1,113. It was longer at 3.74 meters. It was faster on good roads, reaching 80 kilometers per hour compared to the Jeep's 105. It used less fuel, consumed less rubber, required less steel to manufacture, but the Kübelwagen had rear-wheel drive. The Jeep had 4-wheel drive. That single difference rendered every other comparison meaningless. Schmidt watched as his driver attempted to climb a rocky slope in the Kübelwagen they'd brought for comparison. The vehicle struggled, wheels spinning, losing traction on loose stone. Then they brought up the captured Jeep. It climbed the same slope in low-range 4-wheel drive without hesitation, tires gripping surfaces that would stop a Kübelwagen cold. The report Schmidt filed 3 days later, dated May 13, 1943, was one of dozens of similar German intelligence assessments compiled throughout the North African campaign. The conclusions were unanimous. The American Jeep was superior to all German light vehicles in every measurable category of combat performance except fuel consumption. This was not new information. German field units had been capturing and using American Jeeps since January 1943, when Afrika Korps reconnaissance elements first encountered abandoned vehicles near Tunisian front lines. By May, every German combat unit in North Africa had compiled similar technical reports. The Jeep was faster, more powerful, more capable in rough terrain, and more reliable under combat conditions than the Kübelwagen. German soldiers called it the Wunderwagen, the Wonder Wagon. They captured them whenever possible, repainted them with German markings, used them until they broke down or ran out of fuel. Captured Jeeps were so highly prized that German logistics officers used them exclusively for rapid supply runs. Company commanders used them for movement between positions. Forward observers used them to reach vantage points inaccessible to other vehicles. Wehrmacht generals, when interviewed after their surrender by United States Army historian Hugh Cole, stated that they admired the Jeep more than any other piece of American equipment. Not the Sherman tank, not the P-51 Mustang, not the B-17 Flying Fortress, the Jeep. What made this remarkable was not just that the Jeep was better than German equivalents. What made it remarkable was that there were so many of them. For every German vehicle on Tunisian roads in May 1943, there appeared to be 10 American Jeeps. The abundance was so overwhelming that German soldiers came to believe each American soldier was issued his own personal Jeep. This was false, but the perception reflected a deeper truth. Between 1941 and 1945, Willys Overland produced 361,300-39 Jeeps. Ford Motor Company, manufacturing under license, produced 277,896. Total production reached 639,235 vehicles in 4 years. By comparison, Germany produced approximately 50,435 Kübelwagens during the entire war. The Americans were building Jeeps at a rate of approximately 160,000 units per year. The Germans were building Kübelwagens at a rate of approximately 8,500 units per year. The ratio was nearly 19-1. This disparity was not the result of superior German engineering failing against inferior American design. German engineers understood clearly that the Kübelwagen was an excellent vehicle for its intended purpose: light reconnaissance and liaison work in areas with good roads or firm terrain. The problem was that the Jeep's intended purpose was everything. The Willys MB, to use its official designation, was the U.S. Army truck, quarter-ton, 4x4, command reconnaissance. It measured 131 inches long, stood 69.8 inches high with the canvas top-up, had an 80-inch wheelbase, and seated 5 soldiers when packed tight. Under the hood sat a 134.2 cubic inch inline, 4-cylinder engine that soldiers called the Go Devil. It produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute and 105 foot-pounds of torque at 2,000 revolutions per minute. The top speed on good roads was 65 miles per hour. The fuel tank held 15 gallons, giving it a range of approximately 300 miles under highway conditions. Ground clearance was 9 inches. The suspension used longitudinal semi-elliptic leaf springs front and rear. The 4-wheel drive system featured a 2-speed transfer case with selectable high and low range gearing. The transmission was 3-speed manual. The differential was a Spicer unit with an open design. The specifications told part of the story, but they did not explain why German soldiers coveted this vehicle above everything else in the American arsenal. The answer lay not in any single technical feature, but in the philosophical difference the Jeep represented. German military vehicles were designed as specialized tools. The Kübelwagen was a reconnaissance vehicle. The Opel Blitz was a cargo truck. The SD KFZ 251 half-track was a personnel carrier. Each vehicle had a specific role and was optimized for that role. Switching roles meant switching vehicles, which required complex logistics and careful resource allocation. The Jeep was designed as a universal tool. It could perform any light vehicle role adequately well: reconnaissance, transport, cargo, hauling, ambulance, communication, command and control, weapons platform, artillery towing. The vehicle itself was less important than the concept behind it. American military doctrine had figured out that having one vehicle that could do 10 things adequately well was more valuable than having 10 specialized vehicles that could each do one thing perfectly, especially when that one vehicle could be mass-produced in quantities that made individual losses irrelevant. This realization did not originate with American military planners. It emerged from the design process itself, which began in June 1940, when the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps issued specifications for a lightweight, 4-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle. The requirement went out to 135 manufacturers. 3 responded: American Bantam Company, Willys Overland Motors, and Ford Motor Company. The initial specification was demanding. The vehicle had to weigh no more than 1,300 pounds. It had to carry a crew of 3 plus a radio. It had to have 4-wheel drive. It had to be capable of 45 miles per hour on roads and traverse rough terrain. It had to be simple, enough for field maintenance by soldiers with minimal training. American Bantam delivered the first working prototype in September 1940, just 49 days after receiving the contract. The Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or BRC, weighed 1,830 pounds, exceeding the weight limit but meeting every other requirement. The Army tested it extensively at Camp Holabird, Maryland. The vehicle performed beyond expectations. Willys Overland submitted their prototype, called the Quad, in November 1940. It was heavier at 2,450 pounds but featured a more powerful engine producing 60 horsepower compared to Bantam's 45. Ford submitted their prototype, called the Pygmy, in November 1940. It incorporated design elements from both the Bantam and Willys vehicles. The Army tested all 3 prototypes against each other throughout late 1940 and early 1941. Each vehicle had strengths. Bantam's was lightest and most nimble. Willys had the most powerful engine. Ford's had the most refined bodywork. In January 1941, the Army made a decision that would define American military logistics for the next 4 years. Instead of selecting one design and one manufacturer, the Army combined the best features of all three. They took Willys' engine, Ford's bodywork, and elements of Bantam's chassis. They standardized the result into a single design that both Willys and Ford would produce. Bantam, despite creating the original concept, was excluded from major production contracts because the Army doubted their capacity to scale up manufacturing. The standardized vehicle was designated the Willys MB when produced by Willys Overland and the Ford GPW when produced by Ford. The letters GPW stood for Government, P for the 80-inch wheelbase, and W for Willys licensed design. Ford began production in February 1942. By the time Schmidt was measuring the captured Jeep in Tunisia in May 1943, American factories had already produced over 150,000 units. Production would continue at a rate exceeding 10,000 units per month until the war ended. The vehicles were shipped to every theatre of operations: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, the Pacific Islands, Burma, China, the Soviet Union, under Lend-Lease. German intelligence officers who examined captured Jeeps in 1942 and 1943 consistently noted specific technical features that demonstrated American industrial philosophy. The engine was simple, accessible, designed for field maintenance. Every component was overbuilt, designed to survive abuse. The four-wheel drive system used heavy-duty components that could withstand continuous operation in conditions that would destroy lighter German equivalents. The Kübelwagen, by contrast, was designed to different priorities. Its air-cooled engine required no radiator, eliminating a vulnerable component and reducing maintenance requirements. Its lightweight construction, at 725 kilograms, meant crews could physically manhandle the vehicle if it became stuck. Its flat, smooth underbody allowed it to slide over obstacles that might snag vehicles with more complex suspensions. These were genuine advantages in specific situations. The air-cooled engine performed reliably in extreme cold, where water-cooled engines froze. The lightweight made the Kübelwagen easier to extract from soft sand or mud. The flat underbody allowed it to traverse terrain by essentially sliding across the surface like a powered sled. But in practical combat use, these advantages were outweighed by fundamental limitations. The Kübelwagen's rear-wheel drive configuration meant it could not match the Jeep's traction in rough terrain. Its 23.5 horsepower engine could not match the Jeep's 60. Its open differential could not match the Jeep's four-wheel drive capability. Its lighter construction meant it could not tow heavy loads or carry as much equipment. German field tests of captured Jeeps consistently documented superior performance across virtually every metric that mattered in combat operations. The Jeep climbed slopes the Kübelwagen could not. It forded water the Kübelwagen could not cross. It carried loads the Kübelwagen could not manage. It operated reliably in conditions that would disable a Kübelwagen. Most importantly, the Jeep could be repaired in the field with basic tools. The Go Devil engine was bulletproof in its simplicity. 4 cylinders inline, L-head configuration, minimal complexity. A reasonably competent mechanic could rebuild one with basic hand tools in a few hours. German mechanics who worked on captured Jeeps consistently reported that American automotive engineering prioritized maintainability and reliability over sophistication. This was a deliberate design choice that reflected deeper American industrial philosophy. German engineering traditionally emphasized precision, efficiency, and technical excellence. Components were machined to tight tolerances. Designs were optimized for performance. The result was equipment that performed beautifully, when properly maintained but required skilled technicians and precise replacement parts when things broke. American engineering emphasized ruggedness, simplicity, and repairability. Components were overbuilt with generous tolerances. Designs prioritized reliability over optimization. The result was equipment that could be maintained by soldiers with minimal training using basic tools and improvised parts. This philosophical difference extended throughout the entire military vehicle ecosystem. German military trucks were well-engineered, sophisticated machines that required trained mechanics and proper facilities for maintenance. American military trucks were crude, simple machines that any soldier could fix with a wrench and a hammer. The Jeep represented this philosophy perfected. It was not elegant, it was not sophisticated, it was not technically impressive. But it worked reliably, and it could be fixed when it broke. Those three qualities made it more valuable than any amount of technical sophistication. By March 1943, when the Afrika Korps was fighting its final battles in Tunisia, German units throughout North Africa had accumulated dozens of captured Jeeps. Every unit that managed to acquire one used it preferentially over German vehicles. The Jeeps were assigned to the most critical tasks: command vehicles for senior officers, scout vehicles for reconnaissance units, medical vehicles for casualty evacuation, supply vehicles for forward logistics. German after-action reports from Tunisia consistently noted that American mobility was a critical factor in their defeat. American units could reposition faster than German forces could respond. American logistics could sustain operations that German logistics could not match. American reconnaissance could gather intelligence that German reconnaissance could not obtain. The common factor in all these capabilities was the Jeep. It was the vehicle that made American tactical mobility possible. It allowed company commanders to move between platoon positions in minutes. It allowed battalion commanders to coordinate attacks in real time. It allowed logistics officers to identify supply bottlenecks and redirect resources immediately. German forces had no equivalent capability. German company commanders moved on foot or by motorcycle. German battalion commanders used Kübelwagens or command vehicles that could not traverse rough terrain. German logistics officers relied on scheduled supply runs that could not adapt to changing tactical situations. The mobility gap was not just technical, it was operational. American forces could make decisions and implement them immediately because their commanders had the transportation to move where they needed to be. German forces made decisions based on outdated information because their commanders could not reach the front lines quickly enough to assess situations personally. This operational advantage compounded. Throughout the North African campaign, American units that took casualties could request reinforcements and receive them within hours because Jeeps could move replacement troops forward rapidly. German units that took casualties waited days for reinforcements because German logistics could not move troops forward as quickly. American units that expended ammunition could receive resupply within hours because Jeeps could shuttle ammunition forward continuously. German units that expended ammunition waited for scheduled supply convoys that might not arrive for days. American units that needed medical evacuation could transport wounded soldiers to aid stations within minutes. German units that needed medical evacuation relied on dedicated ambulance vehicles that were often unavailable or lacked mobility to reach forward positions. The cumulative effect of these small advantages was devastating. American forces could sustain combat operations at a tempo German forces could not match. They could exploit tactical opportunities German forces could not pursue. They could recover from setbacks German forces could not overcome. By May 1943, when Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, over 267,000 troops laid down their arms. Among the equipment German soldiers observed during those final chaotic days were vehicles that had become ubiquitous across every American position. Small, open-topped, four-wheeled machines that moved with capability unlike anything the Wehrmacht possessed. These American vehicles, barely larger than motorcycles with wheels, were climbing terrain that would stop a Kübelwagen cold. They were carrying soldiers and equipment, moving at speeds that seemed impossible for their size. And they were everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. The pattern German forces observed in Tunisia would repeat across every subsequent theatre of the war: in Sicily in July 1943, in Italy throughout 1943 and 1944, in France after D-Day, in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge, in Germany itself during the final campaigns. Wherever German forces encountered American units, they encountered Jeeps in numbers that seemed impossible. German intelligence estimates consistently underestimated American vehicle production by factors of 2 or 3. The actual numbers were beyond German comprehension. American soldiers were so numerous and so well supplied that the perception of individual jeeps for every soldier, while factually false, captured an essential truth about American material abundance. On December 16, 1944, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny stood in a command post near Lochheim, Belgium, watching his carefully planned operation fall apart before it had properly begun. Skorzeny commanded Panzer Brigade 150, a special unit assembled for Operation Greif, the most audacious mission of the Battle of the Bulge. His orders were to use German soldiers in American uniforms, driving captured American vehicles, to infiltrate behind American lines, seize bridges over the Meuse River, and hold them for the advancing 6th SS Panzer Army. The operation required 100 captured American jeeps. Skorzeny had received approximately 30. He had requested 15 American tanks. He received 2, one of which broke down before the offensive began. He asked for 3,300 soldiers total. He got 2,500, of whom only 10 spoke fluent American English with knowledge of American idioms. Another 30 to 40 spoke English well, but with no knowledge of slang. 120 to 150 spoke English moderately well. The rest spoke little to no English. Skorzeny was one of Hitler's favorite commandos, a man who had rescued Mussolini from Italian captivity and kidnapped the son of the Hungarian regent. He was experienced, capable, and ruthless. But Operation Greif was designed around a premise that could not be fulfilled. The Germans simply did not have enough captured American equipment to make the operation viable. Specifically, they did not have enough jeeps. The problem was not lack of trying. Since early 1944, German forces had been ordered to capture intact American vehicles whenever possible. Special teams were assigned to recover abandoned or damaged American equipment from battlefields. Repair facilities were established to restore captured vehicles to working condition. But American jeeps, despite being ubiquitous on the battlefield, were surprisingly difficult to capture intact. American units disabled their vehicles before abandoning them. Standing orders required removing distributor, caps, draining fuel, and destroying critical engine components if retreat was necessary. American soldiers developed tactics specifically designed to deny equipment to the enemy. When abandoning a jeep, some units would pull the pin from a fragmentation grenade, place the grenade under the driver's verrucase, seat with the spoon held down by the seat cushion, and walk away. Anyone sitting in the driver's seat would trigger the grenade. Multiple German soldiers were killed or wounded this way before the tactic became known. Even when jeeps were captured intact, keeping them running was difficult. The vehicles consumed fuel at rates German logistics could not sustain. The 60-horsepower Go Devil engine burned gasoline in quantities that shocked German supply officers accustomed to the fuel-efficient Kübelwagen. German fuel in 1944 was often adulterated with synthetic additives that fouled American carburetors. Spare parts were non-existent. American jeeps used different bolt sizes, different electrical standards, different tire dimensions than German vehicles. Maintaining captured jeeps required cannibalizing other captured jeeps for parts, which rapidly reduced the number of operational vehicles. By December 1944, despite 18 months of systematic effort to acquire American vehicles, the German military had fewer than 200 operational captured jeeps in all of Western Europe. Of those, approximately 30 were allocated to Skorzeny's operation. The rest were scattered among various commands, most used by senior officers as personal transportation, because they were more reliable and comfortable than German equivalents. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Skorzeny launched his operation anyway. Approximately 150 German soldiers, organized into small teams, were assigned to infiltrate American lines. The English-speaking commandos drove in captured jeeps, wore American uniforms over their German uniforms as required by international law, carried American weapons, and had forged American identification papers. Their mission was to spread confusion, cut communication lines, redirect traffic, change road signs, and reconnoiter routes to the Meuse bridges. The operation achieved modest success for approximately 48 hours. German teams successfully misdirected some American units, cut telephone cables, changed road signs, and gathered intelligence on American positions. But the fundamental flaw in the operation quickly became apparent. There were so many actual American jeeps on the roads that German imposters blended into normal traffic initially. However, American military police became suspicious of unusual patterns. Skorzeny had made a critical error in planning. He assumed American jeeps normally carried 4 soldiers because German vehicles normally carried 4 soldiers. In fact, American practice was to assign 2 or occasionally 3 men per jeep. 4 was unusual. Once American counterintelligence identified this pattern, every jeep with 4 occupants became suspect. Multiple German teams were stopped, questioned, and captured because of this. Detail: the captured Germans revealed the operation under interrogation. Within 72 hours, American forces throughout the Ardennes were on high alert for German infiltrators. Roadblocks multiplied, password challenges became constant, military police questioned drivers about American culture and slang. The paranoia spread beyond actual threats. American soldiers began shooting at other American soldiers who gave incorrect answers to impromptu quiz questions about baseball or movie stars. General Eisenhower was confined to his headquarters for several days because of concerns about assassination attempts. 3 members of Skorzeny's teams were captured near WWII, Belgium, on December 17, 1944. Oberfähnrich Gunther Billing, Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt, and Unteroffizier Manfred Pernas were found carrying Wehrmacht paybooks, wearing German uniforms under their American uniforms, possessing forged American papers, and carrying both American and British weapons. They were tried by military court-martial on December 21 and executed by firing squad on December 23, 1944. Skorzeny himself was wounded in the face by American artillery on December 21 and evacuated from the front. Panzer Brigade 150 was used as a conventional combat unit and suffered heavy casualties attacking Malmedy. The operation was a complete failure in terms of its stated objectives. Not a single Meuse bridge was captured or even reached. The secondary objective of spreading confusion succeeded briefly, but ultimately had no significant impact on the battle. After the war, Skorzeny was tried for war crimes related to Operation Greif. The specific charge was improper use of enemy uniforms, a violation of the Hague Convention. Skorzeny's defense argued that wearing enemy uniforms for deception was legal as long as the uniforms were removed before combat. A key defense witness was F.E. Yo Thomas, a former British Special Operations executive agent, who testified that he and his operatives wore German uniforms behind enemy lines. Skorzeny was acquitted on all charges in September 1947. He subsequently escaped from an internment camp in July 1948 with help from former SS officers. The failure of Operation Greif highlighted a problem that German commanders had struggled with throughout the war. American logistics were so overwhelming that even when German forces successfully infiltrated American lines or captured American equipment, the sheer quantity of American material made it impossible to blend in or sustain operations. The 30 jeeps Skorzeny had were insignificant compared to the thousands of actual American jeeps operating in the same area. German imposters were drops of ink in an ocean of genuine American vehicles. This was the fundamental asymmetry of the war in Western Europe after 1944. Germany was fighting with carefully husbanded resources against an opponent with effectively unlimited supplies. Every German vehicle was precious, tracked in detailed inventories, maintained as long as possible. American vehicles were disposable. When a jeep broke down, American mechanics often simply abandoned it and requisitioned a replacement. The bureaucracy to track and replace a $649 vehicle was not worth the effort. This shocked German prisoners of war, who had spent years making do with inadequate supplies and carefully maintaining worn equipment. German prisoners of war captured in 1945 consistently reported shock at American wastefulness. They watched American soldiers discard equipment that German soldiers would have carefully preserved. Worn boots replaced instead of repaired, damaged tools thrown away instead of fixed, jeeps with minor mechanical problems pushed to the side of roads and abandoned. For German soldiers who had spent years making do with inadequate supplies, fighting with worn equipment, and cannibalizing broken vehicles for parts, the American abundance was incomprehensible. The Jeep became the symbol of this disparity. It was not the most powerful American weapon, not the most advanced, not the most feared, but it was the most visible. German soldiers saw Jeeps everywhere, all the time, in numbers that made no sense to men whose armies moved primarily on foot or by horse-drawn wagon. The presence of Jeeps meant American logistics were functioning. Where there were Jeeps, there was fuel, there were supplies, there was organization. German tactical planning in Western Europe after D-Day increasingly revolved around this reality. Attacking American positions meant facing not just American infantry and armor, but American mobility. Cutting off American units was nearly impossible because they could relocate faster than German forces could encircle them. Disrupting American supply lines achieved little because American logistics had so much redundancy that losing a few trucks or jeeps made no practical difference. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Division, later wrote detailed accounts of fighting the Americans in France for the United States Army Historical Division. His manuscripts described how American units at every level, from platoon to division, had organic transportation that let them respond to changing situations in minutes rather than hours. German units, even elite panzer divisions, could not match this flexibility because their logistics trains were too cumbersome and their light vehicles too few and too fragile. The Kübelwagen was a good vehicle for its intended purpose, but it could not match the Jeep's performance in rough conditions, could not carry the same loads, could not tow artillery pieces, could not ford deep water. In November 1943, the United States War Department issued Technical Manual TME 9-803, a complete technical description of the German Kübelwagen. The manual was dated June 6, 1944, D-Day. The timing was likely coincidental, but the purpose was clear. The manual was intended for American troops who might encounter abandoned German vehicles after the Normandy invasion and want to use them. The manual's assessment was blunt. The Volkswagen, the German equivalent of the American Jeep, is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. This assessment was reiterated in the War Department's Technical Manual TME 30-451, Handbook on German Military Forces, published in March 1945. British engineers who examined captured Kübelwagens reached similar conclusions. A report from the Humber Car Company stated the vehicle exhibited no special brilliance in design and suggested it was not to be regarded as an example of first-class modern design to be copied by British industry. These assessments were not entirely fair. The Kübelwagen was designed to different specifications than the Jeep, optimized for different priorities. It was lighter, had better fuel economy, required no radiator, and could slide over obstacles. But in practical combat use, these advantages were outweighed by the Jeep's raw capability and overwhelming numerical superiority. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, later identified what he considered the most vital pieces of equipment to Allied success. In his memoir, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, he wrote that most senior officers came to regard 4 pieces of equipment as among the most vital to success in Africa and Europe: the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 airplane. Notably, all 4 were logistics platforms, not weapons. Eisenhower understood what many historians would later overlook. Modern industrial warfare was won by logistics, not tactics. The side that could move more men and material to the right place at the site, right time would win. The Jeep was the smallest but most numerous component of American logistics superiority. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied occupation forces found thousands of captured American vehicles in German hands. Many had been repainted with German markings, some had been modified with armor or weapons. A few had been carefully maintained and were still in excellent condition. Most showed signs of hard use and inadequate maintenance, run on poor fuel with improvised repairs. The most remarkable discovery was not the number of captured vehicles, but the documented German efforts to reverse engineer the Jeep and produce a domestic copy. In late 1944, with Germany's industrial capacity collapsing under Allied bombing, the Wehrmacht had initiated a program to develop a German equivalent to the Jeep. Engineers at Volkswagen were tasked with designing a four-wheel drive version of the Kübelwagen that could match the Jeep's performance. Prototypes were built and tested. The vehicle used Kübelwagen chassis and body components combined with a more powerful engine and a four-wheel drive system adapted from captured American examples. The prototypes reportedly performed well in testing, but by the time development was complete in early 1945, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. The program was abandoned when Allied forces overran the Volkswagen factory in April 1945. Otto Skorzeny died in Madrid, Spain on July 5, 1975. He had fled to Spain after escaping internment and settled there under Franco's protection. He occasionally gave interviews about his wartime experiences. When asked about Operation Grief, he consistently stated that the operation was doomed from the start, not because of flaws in planning or execution, but because the Germans simply did not have the material resources to compete with American logistics. He specifically cited the shortage of captured Jeeps as evidence of the broader problem. The Americans had so many that capturing them should have been easy, yet even systematic efforts over 18 months yielded fewer than 200 operational vehicles. Fritz Bayerlein survived the war and contributed extensively to the United States Army's historical program. Between 1945 and 1954, he authored approximately 20 detailed manuscripts about Wehrmacht operations in Normandy, the Ardennes, and other campaigns. His accounts consistently emphasize the impact of American material superiority, particularly mobility and logistics. Bayerlein died in Germany in 1970. That is how the Jeep became the most admired piece of American equipment among German soldiers, not through firepower or technological innovation, but through reliable utility available in unlimited quantities. It was everywhere. It worked. And there was always another one. The vehicle itself was unremarkable, a simple quarter-ton truck with a four-cylinder engine and four-wheel drive. But what it represented was revolutionary. An army that could afford to treat a sophisticated mechanical vehicle as a disposable commodity. Industrial capacity so vast that individual losses were statistically invisible. That was the force that defeated Germany. Not better soldiers or better generals, but better logistics, built on an industrial foundation that could produce 640,000 identical vehicles in 4 years, while simultaneously building tanks, aircraft, ships, and everything else an army needed. The Jeep was just one small part of that machine, but it was the part German soldiers saw most clearly. When German engineers tested captured Jeeps in Tunisia, they were measuring more than ground clearance and engine displacement. They were measuring the gap between German industrial capacity and American industrial capacity. They were documenting, with precision instruments and detailed reports, the inevitable conclusion of a war that had already been decided by factories in Detroit and Toledo. The irony was that German engineering was not inferior. The Kübelwagen was an excellent design. German manufacturing was not incompetent. German soldiers were not less capable. But none of that mattered when the opponent could produce 19 Jeeps for every Kübelwagen, and those Jeeps could do things Kübelwagens could not. The 640,000 Jeeps that rolled off American assembly lines between 1941 and 1945 did not make Blitzkrieg obsolete through superior technology. They made it obsolete through superior logistics. They demonstrated that modern warfare required not just tactical brilliance or operational excellence, but industrial supremacy at a scale that could sustain continuous operations indefinitely. German military doctrine had been built on the assumption that wars would be won by superior tactical execution with limited resources. The Jeep proved that assumption wrong. Wars would be won by adequate tactical execution with unlimited resources. the side that could field more vehicles, more weapons, more soldiers, more supplies, would eventually grind down any opponent, regardless of tactical sophistication. This was the lesson German engineers learned when they measured those captured jeeps in Tunisia. This was the lesson German commanders learned when they fought American forces in France. This was the lesson the entire Wehrmacht learned during the final year of the war. Industrial warfare had changed. The nation that could produce the most would prevail, regardless of military skill or tactical innovation. The Jeep was America's answer to Blitzkrieg, not a faster tank or a better aircraft, but 640,000 simple, reliable trucks that could be everywhere at once, doing everything that needed to be done, replaced immediately when destroyed. That was the weapon that ended the war in Europe. That was the force German soldiers admired most, not because it was impressive, but because it was impossible to defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.